Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, Speak Crime to Me. My name is Elena. On today's episode, I'm going to recap Tuesday and Wednesday of the Murdaugh trial. As we know, Monday was a holiday and the defense did let us know that they think they are going to rest by Friday. So let's dive in to see what's happened the first half of the week. So we start Tuesday off with some housekeeping notes from the judge letting us know that another juror is sick. So they are replacing that person with another alternate, which leaves just 2 alternates left. Remember, we started with 6. So let's hope this trial wraps up shortly so we don't find out what happens if we lose any more jurors. So the judge kind of slammed the defense lawyer Griffin about retweeting or tweeting an article from the Washington Post. Basically was just coming down on him that this is not acceptable, and he agreed not to do any more of this until the trial is over. So we start the day off with the defense calling Buster Murdaugh. Before I go in this testimony, I am just going to say I felt personally like he was an unreliable, uncredible witness. I could tell, or I felt like that he was clearly on his dad's side. And honestly, I don't even know if he was actually being that truthful. Again, this is just my thoughts. I kind of felt like I felt whatever he was saying on the stand was just to help his dad. So as always, leave your comments below. I want to know what you all thought about this Buster Murdaugh testimony, but let's dive in to see what he said. So they first just started out questioning him about his dad, if his dad was a family man, and he points out that his dad and mom never messed like games, sports games, and Alec Murdaugh was his coach. They talk about the Moselle property and just how the property was large and there was hunting grounds and swamp land and that they left guns all over that property. He testifies that he never saw Paul's replacement .300 blackout rifle. To me, that seems strange. Then also says that he's never alternated between a buckshot and a birdshot round and a shotgun. And that is how the gun was loaded that killed Paul. Talks about the coming and goings out of the Moselle property and how they all left out of the main gate. So that was the gate that did not pass by the kennels. Talks about how Alec Murdaugh was very close to his parents, so Buster's grandparents. Alec Murdaugh went to go visit his parents on a regular basis. Maddie Murdaugh didn't go as often. He said that the family spoke via phone frequently. And Alec Murdaugh called Buster on June 7th at 9:10 to say that he was going to Alameda. And I just have to say, when I was writing these notes, and I'm just like, can you imagine that your dad just killed your mom and brother and he's calling you like 20 minutes later and acting normal? Crazy. He claims that Alec Murdaugh misplaced his phone often, and that he often left his phone at Moselle when he went to the kennels. Now, this is one of the things that was a red flag for me because we have had so many people testify that Alec Murdaugh never left his phone anywhere. And Buster Murdaugh was not at this property very often. So it seems strange to me that he would testify this, given testimonies that we have heard that Alec Murdaugh was literally glued to his cell phone at all times. He said that he knew a little bit about his father's pill addiction, and this was interesting because we've not heard this before, but apparently after Christmas in 2018, Alec Murdaugh went to a detox facility. Then they just talk about family conversations and fights, and he says they were all civil and they never got violent, and points out that his mom, Maggie, was very anxious about the civil trial coming up about the boat accident. He says also that no one thought that Paul Murdaugh was driving the boat in that boat crash. However, again, we've heard from so many witnesses on that boat that evening that dispute this. They start talking about the night or the moment that Alec Murdaugh called Buster about his mom and brother being shot, that him and his girlfriend quickly packed a bag. They went over to Moselle, that Buster helped pack a bag for his dad so they could not stay at Moselle that night, and then they came back the next day and that Alec Murdaugh took a shower at the Moselle property. Then the defense just wants to point out that Buster Murdaugh was with his dad almost every day, never left his sight after the shootings, that he didn't disappear for periods of time. Remember, the state is kind of saying that he left and went to Alameda sometimes with that tarp or the raincoat, and that he was with him until June 17th. And then the last thing they kind of just talk about is how Alec Murdaugh would leave clothes in various different locations: Alameda, Moselle, the beach property, his brother's house, both his brother's houses that he was staying at, and just a lot of different locations. I think that was to try to reference about the missing clothes that Alec Murdaugh was wearing during just going around the Moselle property that night. Then the prosecution takes over to cross-examine Buster. They point out that Buster had no knowledge of the financial crimes, and that was it. And they just that was the end of Buster's testimony. So let's move on to the next defense witness, Mike Sutton. He's a North Carolina engineer who creates crime scene exhibits and animations, and he also is an acoustics expert. They did rule him as an expert witness in these fields. So they start out by showing some diagrams that Mike Sutton created of the shootings, and they start disputing the trajectory that the prosecution had told us that these shots were fired. So they said that the barrel that fired the bullet had to be less than 4 feet off the ground, that the person likely fired from the hip to create this trajectory. Even a short person couldn't have fired from the shoulder. Based on the model, the 14-degree downward shot into the doghouse and the 1.5-degree upward shot into the quail pen were shot from the same person and at the same place right by Maggie's body. So they are saying the shooter was 5'2" or something like a person crouching or kneeling over. Shooting hand would have to be below his kneecap. And then they say that Maggie's shooter would have to be 5'2" to 5'4". Then they start talking about the acoustic of the shots. The shot into the feed room, which muffled the sound of the shotgun. The .300 blackout rifle that killed Maggie was louder than the shotgun that killed Paul. Then they start talking about Maggie's phone being thrown out the window again. And they point out that Alec Murdaugh didn't slow down to throw the phone, but then they point out he also didn't punch the gas at that time. They go back to this theory that, and this person says that if someone driving the Suburban with those headlights, they could have seen the bodies as they were pulling up to the kennels. And that ends the defense testimony, and we now have the prosecution cross-examining. They point out that he is being paid $14,000 to testify. Point out that he's also primarily an expert in accident reconstruction, and that he was previously retained for the 2019 boat crash case. Then the prosecution starts really getting into this witness, and they Sutton is trafficking and guest working and speculating, and he is not actually proving science with what he is stating. They also point out that he is not certified in shooting reconstruction. He is not a pathologist nor a firearms expert. And then they start asking him about timestamps with these phones and things like that. And this witness, Sutton, says that he has a laptop to pull up the timestamps to reference the version of the graph. And then the defense shows an example to Sutton rendering an opinion from the stand in which he couldn't see two key variables. Basically trying to point out that, again, he's assuming, he is implying, he's not actually forthcoming with accurate information. So didn't use the exact same guns and ammunition in those sound tests that were used in the killings. They also point out that the sound test that he did was in January of this year, so January 2023, and the pine trees had grown quite a lot since these killings, and that could have also changed the sound of how these shots actually sounded like back in 2021. They also try to discredit Sutton with the bullet trajectory analysis from the first shot in the blast at Paul. And another thing is they start going into about this person being 5'1", between 5'4", and he's like, or the prosecution's like, we're not talking about 12-year-olds here. And I'm sure we all assume that this murderer was not a woman. I'm 5'1". How many 5'1" males do we know out there? So I thought that was quite funny and was kind of a good point. And the defense just goes back to say that all this information that he was testifying and doing his analysis on was all the information that was provided from SLED. And that is how we wrapped up Tuesday of the Murdaugh trial. So let's dive into Wednesday. So we start Wednesday morning with the defense bringing up the argument about whether Alec Murdaugh is going to take the stand or not. The defense is requesting an order from the judge preventing the state from cross-examining Alec Murdaugh about the financial records. And this just goes back and forth, and basically the judge just says that he can't do that, or he's not going to do that, but he can provide, I guess, like some steps. And so I think we're going to hear about this a little bit on Thursday, so tomorrow, and we'll know hopefully a little bit more or have an inkling if he's going to actually take the stand or not. So the defense's first witness is Mark Ball. He is a PMPED lawyer, so he worked with Alec Murdaugh. We know now that that law firm no longer exists. I think it's called Parker Law Group now. He has known Alec Murdaugh for 34 years, and his kids are around the similar ages as Buster and Paul, and so they basically all grew up together. He arrived to the crime scene about 2 hours after the murders occurred and said that the first responders and law enforcement officers were walking all over the crime scene. Again, this goes back to how the defense has really been pounding hard that the crime scene was not preserved. And I was just having an inkling about this when I was listening to the trial today. This is a very small town. So you have to believe that they don't have the resources and probably the same expertise and experience in preserving crime scenes like a large city would have. That's just my thought. Again, comment below if you guys have any additional thoughts. Then he starts to go on about how it had been raining on and off when he got there that evening, and he didn't want, apparently there was like water coming in or on top of Paul's body, and he just thought that was very disgraceful. Around 1:30 to 2 a.m., I guess they asked investigators if they could go to Moselle the main house, Moselle, and they said yes, and he says they start cleaning up the house. And remember when Blanca, the housekeeper, testified, she said it was really weird that the pots and pans were put away. However, if you guys remember, Blanca says that Alec Murdaugh sent her to that house the next morning to clean up. So I kind of feel like this kind of contradicts each other, because he's saying they cleaned up that night, but then why would Alec Murdaugh ask her to go back? Just something to point out. I'm sure he probably wasn't thinking, but... On June 8th, he says that SLED released the crime scene, and he went to the kennels and saw birdshot pellets on floors and the shelves, as well as a part of Paul's skull the size of a baseball still lying on the ground. He asked SLED if they need to take any more of this evidence, and SLED basically says no, they have everything they need. And then they start talking about his character. Again, the defense is trying to make us believe that Alec Murdaugh is this great guy. However, he says that he thought he was a great person until after September 3rd and everything started tumbling down. That Alec Murdaugh betrayed the law firm when he started stealing money. And then the prosecution takes over. They point out by saying that he really didn't know Alec Murdaugh. They also talk about that dog video at 8:44, 8:45. He also confirms that there's 3 voices, Alec, Paul, and Maggie's. They talk about the night of the 7th when he's talking to Alec Murdaugh, and he says when he arrives, he's distraught, but he's able to make complete sentences. He denied going to the kennels at least 3 times when talking to Mr. Ball. And the story changed over time about whose body he went and touched or checked first. Then he starts to say that himself and the law firm were focused on who the killer was. They were trying to see if they needed to get additional security or just dive into a little bit more about what investigators were saying, as they were all very nervous about what was going on. Says, though him and his colleagues were really focused on this investigation, Alec Murdaugh was not. And remember, we did hear this about, I think it was one of Paul's friends who was driving Alec Murdaugh to the airport, and he says that he made that weird statement about all his priority is about clearing Paul's name. So we heard about this story early on from another law partner about how Alec Murdaugh arrived to a 4th of July party with a gun. He also tells us about this story and how that was very strange, and that he actually left the bag with the gun at this person's house anywhere without his phone. Talks about how important it was to Alec Murdaugh about the family legacy, about how important this family or the Murdaugh family had been in this community and how the law firm started. This is something that I guess I've missed, but this is an important part or piece of the puzzle. So apparently, I know we've heard about all this cell phone data, but apparently the state is trying to say that Alec Murdaugh planned the murders when he left, or if he left his phone at the main property the night of the murders. Remember, there is like a, don't quote me, an hour or 2 period of time where we don't have anything from Alec Murdaugh's phone. So now this is all kind of making sense to me, because we have all these individuals testifying how Alec Murdaugh never left his phone. However, Buster Murdaugh testified that he did leave his phone often at the main property, which to me seems like Buster is trying to cover up for his dad, because I think I had pointed out earlier, to me that was strange. So my guess is that is what the state is going to say in their closing arguments, is that he left his phone there, which was extremely odd, and he would have done that on purpose if he had been planning to kill Maggie and Paul. Then they just start talking about how he's easily lied for years and he's very cunning at doing it. They talked about before September 2021 about the slow discovery of Alec Murdaugh and his thefts of the law firm, Apparently, he had cashed in his brother's check years ago. He also would use the firm's credit card for personal expenses and, get this, for one of the children's tuitions. They point out that he stole from one of his very close friends, Barnett Bulware, who had his house burned down by a fire. He talks about how Alec Murdaugh lost a lot of money during the recession, but he was having a lot of cases come up, so he figured that Alec Murdaugh had recovered that money. Then they start talking about the roadside shootings. He said when he heard, his statement was, that jackass killed himself. When he arrived to the scene, he actually went to where the shooting occurred, and he said he didn't believe that someone shot him, that it just seemed off. Again, pointed out the run flat tires. Then they talk about that he has $12 million of insurance policy money. I don't know if that's reflecting about why he committed the shooting. And then the prosecution just leaves with pointing out again that he lied and never told investigators that he was at the kennels on June 7th. And that is how that testimony ends. And we move on to the defense's next witness, Dawes Cook Jr. Dawes Cook Jr., he's a Charleston attorney. He is defending Alec Murdaugh in the boat crash. They brought up the point about Alec Murdaugh's finances, that they weren't going to be, he wasn't in an immediate danger of his finances, crimes being exposed ahead of the June 10th trial. He didn't think Mark Tinsley, remember that is Mallory Beach's attorney we heard from already, had any legal right to detain detailed accounting of Alec Murdaugh's finances. And then the prosecution takes over, and apparently this gentleman took over the case in 2021 after the original attorney had died from cancer. So just pointing out that maybe he did not know everything about what was going on in this case. The prosecution just basically gets him to admit that if the hearing had gone forward, the judge would have ruled if Alec Murdaugh's financials could have been revealed. And obviously that would have been a judge's decision. Next, we go to the defense witness of Kenneth Zierke, also with crime scene reconstruction. He also talks about the correct way to take crime scene photographs so they're useful later in an investigation. They point out that police were not wearing what they call booties on their feet, which they should have been when they're walking around the crime scene. Mention how first responders covered Paul's body with a sheet and they shouldn't have done that. That there also could have been trace evidence on that sheet on Paul's body, but it doesn't seem like that sheet was ever preserved or tested. Also mentioned that there's no evidence that SLED dusted for fingerprints in the feed room. And basically the defense gets him to say that none of the photos of the victims meet standards of crime scene investigations. He is here to disclaim SLED, but he is getting paid here to testify. And they get him to say that SLED, that, end quote, they may have done the best job they could. Again, that goes back to me thinking like a small town, the resources, the training, probably just is not as large as a larger city. Then they start talking about how he doesn't read witness statements or explanations from investigations because he isn't a scientist and statements are not reliable. And that's basically how, again, we end this testimony. And the next person up is Barbara Dixon. Barbara Dixon is Alec Murdaugh's mom's housekeeper. One of the names mentioned when Alec Murdaugh made that 911 call after the shooting, allegedly claiming that she sold him pills. She said that her and Maggie were very close and they talked almost every day. That she called Alec Murdaugh on June 7th, basically saying that his mom was very irritated and asked if he could come by later that evening. And then the defense basically asks her if she ever saw a blue tarp in the house, and she says she's never seen a blue tarp in the house. Again, remember, Shelley Smith is the one that said that she saw Alec Murdaugh bringing in a blue tarp. Next on the stand for the defense is Micah Sturgis. He is a former police officer and detective. Start off by showing the steps and distance of Alec Murdaugh's phone. They start talking about if the phone screen is off, the orientation can't change, phone data. Then they start to discuss when or how Maggie's phone was ditched. Alec Murdaugh passed the location that Maggie's phone was ditched at 9:08 and 9:59. This person claims that very little motion is required to awaken a phone, and that the time that Alec Murdaugh passed this location, Maggie's screen was off. Defense is starting to carve out that they believe that Maggie's phone was ditched at 9:06 and that Alec Murdaugh was not at that location until 2 minutes later. This suggests that someone was swiping the phone from lock screen to activate it, and that 9:07, when Maggie's screen turned off for the next 24 minutes, that Alec Murdaugh was already in his driveway. Prosecution starts the cross-examining by saying that Paula Maggie's phone locked for the final time within the same minute, reiterates how Alec Murdaugh called Maggie's phone 2 seconds after Maggie's orientation changes, argue that someone chucked Maggie's phone, the motion would have turned on her phone screen even if it didn't record and the orientation changed. SLED for not putting Maggie's phone on airplane mode and into one of those protective plastic bags. And then this is very interesting. So they let us know that Maggie's phone was taking in more steps around 8:54, so this would have been after she was murdered, to go the same distance it had gone earlier that hour. So possibly that's indicating that the stride of whoever was holding the phone was shorter after the state believes that she was shot and killed. Extremely weird. Just to summarize, so we learned that Maggie's phone didn't light up when Alec Murdaugh's SUV passed where the phone was ditched, but the defense and the prosecution is having a disagreement about whether Maggie's phone would have lit up when it was ditched. Lots of confusing testimony at the end. Just to summarize, I feel like the defense is going off of they're trying to hound a couple of points. One, that Alec Murdaugh was too tall to be the shooter. 2, that he was a great guy and he would have never have killed his family. 3, that SLED did not preserve the crime scene well enough. On hearing it pounded to us that Alec Murdaugh is not the Alec Murdaugh that most people knew. He was a liar, he was a deceiver, and it's just gonna, I feel like, his character and that Snapchat video. The only other person that the defense has kind of put forward is CB Rowe, and they have basically said that he was not in that area. So we will have to see who else the defense brings forward, but right now I feel like this case is all over the place. So let me know what you all are thinking. Please leave your comments below, and I will be back to update you all on Thursday and Friday of the Murdaugh trial. Thank you all again for joining me here on Speak Crime to Me. Until next time. 2, that